that. Now I'd like to go into session 3, which is one of my favorite parts, on de-escalating techniques for resolving conflicts. Many times when we get in a tense situation with someone, it's kind of like a poker match, a poker game. You know, I see your anger and I raise it up to here. Oh yeah, I see your anger and I raise it up to here. Oh yeah, I see your anger. And it's kind of like that. And de-escalation techniques are those techniques for taking some of the heat out of the situation so you can have a productive conversation. All right, I find these techniques to be very helpful in my personal and professional life, or I wouldn't be offering them. The first one is to state your intention up front in a positive way. And if things get heated, restate what your intention is and is not. I want you to remember whenever you go into a tense conversation with someone, many times the first words that come out of your mouth may impact how the entire conversation goes. Let me give you an example. When I started as my career, I was a high school English teacher in Cedar Rapids, Iowa at Regis High School. I was all of 22 years old teaching 17, 18-year-old students. And occasionally I had to call a parent at home to tell them their son or daughter was doing poorly in my class, or maybe they were messing around in my class. And the first few times I called parents at home, I just did terribly. It was just a mess. Let me tell you how I would do it. This is truly how it would go. I pick up the phone. I say, hello, Mrs. Smith. This is Miss Clark from Regis High School, and I'm having a problem with Johnny in my English class. Now, I don't know how many of you out there right now are saying, oops, she messed up. But I did. I know this from working with live groups that people will say, uh-oh, you really screwed up, Brenda. I started with the phrase, I'm having a problem with Johnny. For many parents, that put them very much on the defensive. And they would say, oh, are you having a problem with Johnny? Are you one of these teachers who has a problem with a lot of students? And aren't you that teacher who's new to Regis High School and right out of college and really doesn't understand how we do things around here? And it would kind of go downhill from there. But through time, I got smarter, and I learned I could get much better results if I started the conversation with a different phrase. I'd pick up the phone and I would say, hello, Mrs. Smith. This is Miss Clark from Regis High School. And Johnny's struggling a little bit in my English class, and I'm just calling, hoping that we can work together and get his grade up as soon as possible so he can have a successful rest of the school year. And then she would say, oh, I'm so glad that you called. What can we do to help? Now, my intention had been the same all along. The only difference was that I had learned to state that intention up front in a much more positive way. For those of you who are supervisors who have to sit down to talk to an employee about unacceptable behavior, I want you to remember this phrase. I want you to be successful here. I want you to be successful here. Those are powerful, positive words to start a confrontation. You know, I want you to be successful here, and for that reason, we need to talk about X, Y, and Z. That's much more apt to lead to an open conversation than starting with, I'm having a problem with the way you're acting around here. The second piece to that is if things get heated, restate what your intention is and is not. My husband Chris and I have been together for 24 years, and I'm always reading about new communication strategies, and I always try them out on him first, and he loves that about being married to me. Actually, he doesn't love it at all. But a few years ago, we were having a discussion about one of our children. We have 3 teenage sons, and we were disagreeing on how to handle something with our son Alex. And I remember we were in his office in the basement talking. Things were getting heated. We were disagreeing, and things were, escalating up, and I could tell he was getting very irritated with me. And in the middle of the conversation, I remembered this technique of restating what your intention is and is not. And I said, Chris, my intention is not to call you a bad parent or to say you're doing a terrible job raising Alex. My intention is just to make sure that we're on the same page so we show a united front in dealing with this with him. And I swear to you, I could see a lot of the tension come out of him. Now, I'm sure he wasn't turning cartwheels because he was so happy, but it certainly was a technique enough to release that tension so we could continue talking. The second is to check your motives up front. You could raise your hand right now if you'd like to be right. If you'd like to be right. Now, those of you who did not raise your hand are lying. We all like to be right, and I always encourage you going into any confrontation to ask yourself, do I really want to peacefully and successfully resolve this situation, or do I just want to be right? Sadly, I bet you all could name people who they've been right. Oh, they won the argument, but they lost much in the process. They lost respect to people, relationships with people, people's desire to work with them. Always ask yourself going into the confrontation, do I really want to resolve this thing, or am I just out to win? Because you might lose much in the process, and your behavior will be very different and the results will be very different. The next suggestion for de-escalation is just to have heightened awareness of what's going on in a conversation and notice when it might be turning tense. We all could probably name body languages that we recognize when someone is getting a little upset, when they're getting heated. You might notice, some people's necks get blotchy. Some people's voices get higher. You might even feel your own heart pounding. Whenever you recognize those signs of tension, I think of it as a large caution sign. Proceed carefully. Choose your words carefully. It's like entering a minefield, and if you say the wrong thing, just haphazardly, it could easily blow up and end that conversation. The next piece related to that is to avoid charged, inflamed language. There are certain phrases that will shut down conversations, and I would guess that most of you know what they are, but we're not always so good about avoiding them. Phrases such as, you always, you never, you're wrong, or whatever. Or I heard a woman the other day in a conference say to me, if you say so. Those are all phrases we want to avoid because they do shut down conversation. The other part of it is to realize the power of tentative language. Many times people say, well, if I'm going to be persuasive, I need to be strong and powerful and say, this is the way it has to be done. This is the only way it can be, and we think we're being powerful. Well, the reality is when we approach people in that way, this is the way it has to be, we tend to respond, not me. We tend to respond very defensively. The more powerful language is ironically tentative language, meaning language that says, I wonder what would happen if we did this. I wonder if we should consider this. What do you suppose would happen if we tried this procedure this way? And what it does is it just opens the door for people to say, oh, we might want to try that. It's very powerful being tentative. A couple more of these, and we're going to get to our silence versus violence assessment. Be aware of the 93% of communication. If I were there live, I would have you turn to the person next to you and tell them that you like their shirt, but do it in such a way that lets them know that you're repulsed by the shirt that they're wearing right now. And the reason I have groups do that, which always gets everybody laughing, is to realize the power of nonverbal communication. Studies tell us that when a person's communicating to you in person, only 7% of what you're picking up is their words. 38% is their tone of voice, and 55% is their body language. So sometimes, people will say, I told him I was totally open to what he had to say. But while they're saying it, they have their arms crossed across their chest and they're leaning back, and everything about their body language says, I'm not open. Always beware of the power of that 93%, which means everything but your words. Voice match is a concept from education that essentially says that if you're in a confrontation with someone, most of the population innately has inborn an ability that we naturally match the tone of voice and the volume of the person that we're speaking with. So if I say, hey, how's it going? A person will respond, hey, it's going fine. And if I say, hey, how's it going? They'll tend to respond, hey, it's going fine. How you can use that is if you're in a confrontation with someone and their voice is getting louder and it's escalating, you can kind of drop your voice back down and they'll tend to follow it. Mirroring, I don't have you there in person, so I'll just mention that some studies have given some pretty powerful evidence that mirroring someone's body language, the way they're sitting, if you're visiting with them in a confrontation and they tend to lean forward and you kind of subtly lean forward with them and kind of match their body language, that people find that you're getting them and they tend to be much more open to what you have to say. There was a study done of MBA candidates that put two of them in the room and they had to kind of iron out a negotiation on an issue. And they found when no body language mirroring occurred, they only reached agreement 12.5% of the time. However, when they pulled one of the candidates aside and said, hey, mirror that guy's body language, they were able to reach agreement 67% of the time. And it's just a part of that feeling that you're connecting, you're getting what they're saying. Now it's time I'd like each one of you to take out your handout, and I hope you had a chance to get it copied. It's a Style Under Stress assessment. And if you haven't had time, I'm going to have just a couple minutes of silence here to let you fill it out. It's a 2-sheet handout that has a number of true or false questions related to how you tend to respond when dealing with tense conversations. So I'm just going to let it go silent for a minute or two and ask that you fill out that sheet, both sides. There also is a tally sheet that you could fill out. It's pretty simple with instructions. So I'm going to go silent for a minute or two and let you fill that out. For those of you who are wondering where is the handout, in the email that you received, it mentioned that there were 2 handouts that you could download, one being the actual handout of the slides and the other being the Style Under Stress assessment. So if you can locate that. If not, I'll email it to you afterwards. If you'll just let me know your email or email me, I can get it to you. But that is where it's located, in that email that you received confirming your participation. Okay, let me take a minute to explain what this is about. The Style Under Stress assessment. The people who developed this assessment would say that if you are the perfect person when it comes to responding to tense conversations, you would have no check marks on that second page. You would have no true statements checked. Okay, and I have very few people who come up perfect in conflict when they take that assessment. Essentially what this assessment says is that most of us, when faced with tension or conflict, we respond somewhere on a continuum between silence and violence. If you picture kind of as a continuum or a number line, silence on one end, violence on the other. Those of us who respond to conflict with silence, we tend to clam up. We hate having a confrontation. We dread sitting down and having to talk with this person. We may not sleep the night before. We get a stomach ache just thinking about it. We see this person coming down the hall. We turn the other direction. We see their number on caller ID. We don't take that call. We just dread having that confrontation. Now those of us who fall on the continuum toward the end of violence tend to get very verbally aggressive. We get a little bit of the go for the jugular instinct. Our voice might become a little bit harsh. It might sound a little bit threatening. We might exaggerate our facts. We might cut people off. We might sound very threatening to some people and intimidating in our voice. Now the question is, first of all, why do we respond that way? It's probably a combination of nature and nurture, the family you grew up in and biologically how we're made. But the question is, which is a better response to conflict? Silence, clamming up, or violence going for the jugular? You're probably guessing that it is in the middle, and you're correct. That real professional people and people who skillfully interact in relationships have to learn the fine art of confronting situations that need to be confronted without doing it in such a way that they absolutely shut down the conversation. Now for those of you, and I want to say, if you take that assessment, depending on how you respond at work, and then you do it again for how you respond at home, it might be slightly different. You know, there are some people who are more silent at home, more violent at work, or vice versa. But what I want to say is if you tend to be more toward the silent type, I probably know what you're thinking because I've listened to enough people do this so I can read your minds. Silent types who take this assessment tend to say to me this, well, at least I'm not yelling and screaming like that buffoon over there. That's what silent types tend to think. And violent types tend to think, well, why don't those silent types get a backbone already and learn to confront their issues? And again, what I want to say is to realize that in tense conversations, you have to realize, move yourself to the center of that continuum, that silent people, there are times in a workplace, particularly as a supervisor, when you have to learn to confront situations that need to be confronted. Lots of times silent people will say, well, I'm taking the high road, you know. I'm not yelling and screaming. Now I am gossiping to 35 other people about it, but I'm taking the high road. You know, that's not any better. And violent people who say, well, at least I'm getting it out on the table, need to realize when they yell and scream at silent people, it absolutely shuts them down. So I really want to stress finding that middle ground when it comes to handling conflict. You'll see on your slide there the top 3, masking, avoiding, withdrawing, are all tend to be behaviors that will happen in silent people, and the bottom 3 are behaviors that tend to happen in violent people. Put up the next couple slides here as we kind of wrap up and get to questions. Silent people, just some suggestions there specifically for you. I do want to say silent types tend to want to use technology to confront issues. They want to send the email. They want to do the text message because they don't want to deal face-to-face with that person and their emotions. Probably a really poor choice because you can't see the person's tone of voice. You can't see their responses, and they will probably read it with the worst possible intonation you can imagine if they're in conflict view. Probably not a good idea. Violent people, you'll notice there's a gorilla there. You may have seen on YouTube, if you ever enter in gorilla in basketball game, a study that was done where they ask you to watch a video of people playing basketball and to count the number of times that the white jerseyed team passes the ball. And you're so busy counting that you don't notice that there's a woman in a gorilla suit that comes across the court and pounds her breast and moves on. And the reason you do that is you're so wrapped up in counting the number of ball passes. Well, I liken that to people in conflict, especially violent people. Many times they get so wrapped up in being right that they don't notice that the other person is apologizing, that the other person is trying to get along. So be aware of that. One thing I'll point out on this slide is it's not about the dirty socks. I had read a marriage researcher many years ago who said couples will go 10 rounds over the fact that the husband left the dirty socks on the bedroom floor. And he said they're not arguing about the socks. They're arguing about questions of respect, of affection, of intimacy, of attention. But it's easier to argue over the socks, and I think that often happens in a workplace. People will go 10 rounds over the fact that someone took their Weight Watchers entree out of the refrigerator, and yet there's deeper issues that are harder to address. This is just a neat little diagram I found in a book a few years back that essentially says if you're only concerned with people when it comes to responding to conflict, you're going to accommodate. You're going to give in every time and become very resentful. If you're only concerned with results, you'll get very aggressive and bowl people over. If you're neither concerned with people and results, you'll just avoid the whole issue. Compromise is somewhere in the middle, but ultimately if you collaborate and work to those win-win situations through understanding, you'll have the ultimate results. All right. That is the basic part of the program. Jane, do you want to chime in for a minute before I go to questions, or should I go straight to questions?
No, thank you, Brenda. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you haven't already, please submit your questions in the Q&A chat box on the left-hand side of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows.
Perfect.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for taking the time to put your questions in, and like I said, for being here. We appreciate it. Here's one. It says the software development process often includes spirited debate. Can you explain how to use your framework more real-time so as to keep spirited debate from escalating to actual conflict? That's an interesting question. I've never been involved in that process of software development, but I could see where that would be an issue. I guess just off the top of my head, my thought would be it would be awfully nice to have someone who serves as a facilitator in that situation, who is responsible not only for participating perhaps in the meeting, but also for noticing how things are going. You know, a facilitator's job is truly to see that conversation continues to be productive, that one person does not dominate, that we keep things on track, that everybody gets a chance to participate, that ideas are paraphrased and summarized. And I would think that in that process, like I said, I'm a little foreign to that process. I would think it would be very helpful to have someone assigned as a process facilitator to keep track of how things are going, just to kind of keep things productive. That would be my best guess off the top of my head. Let me hit another one. We have a few people asking about handouts. What if a coworker has mental issues that cause much of the issues? I think that's a great question. And I think you need to realize as a coworker to what extent you have control over people's behavior and to what extent you do not. That might be something where you'd want to talk to a supervisor and ask them, what are your thoughts? Is there a way that this person needs to be referred to an employee assistance program? What would you recommend? As a coworker, it's always great to be able to, if you're in a friend capacity, to talk to them, and if they seem to be having issues, to mention, I saw a counselor once and they were very helpful, or maybe to throw that out. But also we have to realize to what extent we can't control or change that person. So I think that's good. If they have mental issues, there might be a point where you need to, step back away from that. Oh, this is an interesting question. Is mirroring ever thought of as mocking? And I do think you want to kind of walk that fine line. I always say when I'm demonstrating this in trainings, you don't want it to seem like a game of Simon Says where, they move and you immediately move to follow them. And you certainly don't want to do it with a facial expression or something that indicates that you're mocking them. I think the key is to be very subtle about it. Try not to be manipulative about it, but to genuinely go in, I think, with the intent that I want you to know that I'm understanding you, that I'm really trying to get at what you're trying to say here. And I think the more you come from a genuine place of integrity, I think it will come off more as genuinely trying to understand them rather than as mocking. But I think that's a good cautionary note. Let me see if I have time for another question. Here's a question that a couple are asking about availability in the future, and I'll turn that back over to you when we're done here, Jane. So maybe you can ask about that. Some of them are saying they would like to have had more staff members attend, so maybe you can address that after a bit.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Let me see if I can find another question here Here's a question. It says, is an autocratic fiat style of management helpful in promoting conflict resolution? That's a very interesting question. I think I'd have to talk to you more about exactly what you mean by that, but I think anytime you have a supervisor who's really top-down heavy, I don't know that necessarily that helps with conflict resolution. I think in many ways supervisors kind of become examples to their employees of how to handle conflict, and I can't imagine a real top-heavy approach of this is the way it has to be is that great of an example on how to handle conflict. I think it's important that a manager shows interest in their people, that listens to what they have to say, and that if there is conflict, they do get involved. And that's, again, a whole other program I've done on sharing an example of when I've worked with groups on conflict resolution where they had two groups of employees in conflict, and I worked, for instance, with an executive director to intervene and do conflict resolution among the employees. And I don't know in those cases if the executive director or the CEO had just said essentially, stop it or you're going to be fired, if that would have resolved it. In those cases, we tended to work toward, let's really work through a process of getting at the bottom, at the root cause of this, and make some positive changes. And then in that case, if they didn't respond to that, then these people did tend to make changes and say, we're going to remove some people from their positions. Great questions. Well, it is just about time for me to wrap up here. And I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time and listening. That's a long time to sit here listening. I do appreciate it. I'm going to close with a final closing thought here, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Jane to wrap up. I guess when I think about responding to conflict, to me, one of my ultimate goals in life is to learn to confront situations that need to be confronted, realizing that that is a part of being a successful wife, mother, employee, supervisor, whatever the case may be. I didn't share, there's actually a study that was done of the silence versus violence, where they actually had researchers watch videotapes of newlyweds arguing. And the only thing they watched was the videotapes of them arguing. And they divided them into 3 categories. Those who were the silent type, oh, we don't have any problems in our marriage is perfect. The violent type, the yelling, the screaming, the threatening, the name calling. And then more in the middle, they had heated conversations, but it didn't result to name calling and threats. And they predicted, of course, that middle group would make it to the 10-year anniversary. But they predicted it with 90% accuracy, just by watching videotapes of newlyweds arguing. And I think to me that's very telling about if you want to be successful for long term, whether it's in a relationship or a workplace or whatever, you have to learn to skillfully resolve conflict. So I'm going to close here with a final quote, and I'll turn it back over to Jane. Maintaining your character and integrity are far more important than the outcome of the conflict. This means that sometimes you will fight, sometimes you will step down, and sometimes you will find other solutions. But your behavior will be determined by what you believe is the right thing to do, not by your fear or the behavior of the other person. You can win an argument and lose something far greater when you betray who you are in conflict. Successful people know that no one can take away who you are. So also I'm going to put up the slide here, folks, of my business card that has my website, it has my email address, it has my phone number. Please feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your insights, questions, what's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, suggestions, all of that. Thank you so much for taking the time. And again, Jane and Total Living Choices, thanks for having me today. It's really been my pleasure.
Thank you, Brenda. We do appreciate your time today and sharing your wisdom with us. We do have a few questions that weren't answered today, but we will be sure to address them via email. I want to thank Brenda for her presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. A link to the recording of today's webinar and the handouts, just in case you didn't receive those in the email, will be sent soon. And we'd like you to take a few minutes to respond to our survey at the conclusion of this webinar. And be sure to visit tlchoices.com for more information about our Connect Customer Education Series. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for the latest industry news and trends. Once again, we do thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.